Today I'm delighted to be joined by Gautam Dev, the Global Head of Talent and Change at Standard Life Aberdeen. Gautam is a highly experienced HR director with a varied and successful career working in his native Australia and then Hong Kong for organisations such as Prudential, Eastspring Investments, Coles Group and Accenture. Morning Gautam, many thanks for joining me.
Morning, Mark. Really good to be here. It's a rare day in the office, so it's a pleasant change from working at home.
Absolutely. As I mentioned in the intro, you've enjoyed success across a number of different industries. It would be great to kick off by hearing more about your career and what led you to Hong Kong and then Scotland, please.
It's been a long and varied journey, and mostly, as in so many careers, by luck and chance, Mark. So going even further back, you can probably tell from my accent that I gave up many centuries of Indian culture by migrating to Australia when I was a child. So I grew up there, and my undergrad degree was actually in law and commerce. And I started off my career in banking, and I was arguably the world's worst investment banker. If you wanted a multi-million-dollar loan, I was the guy to come to because I'd sign off at anything. I then went away and did an MBA. And that was fantastic. That got me into the world of management consulting, which was terrific. Really enjoyed it. Projects all over the world for Accenture. You learn a lot. It really accelerates your development. So in your late 20s, early 30s, you're presenting to boards, all fantastic. And the last thing I wanted to do was get into HR. But then an opportunity came up to start a .com business way back. This is the first .com boom. And it was an online recruiting effort. And we launched it, and it was an absolute dismal failure. But it got me to thinking about how important people were to success. And I went back over all my previous Accenture projects. Yeah. And surprise, surprise, the big correlation between the ones that succeeded and failed had nothing to do with the work. It was the people. So that got me into HR. And I did a huge job, as you mentioned in the preamble, with a group called Coles Group, which was a really failing retailer. And we did a big job turning it around. We finished with that. And we were sitting around thinking, what's next? I was very happy in Australia. The kids were 11 and 9. And suddenly this weird phone call came through from a headhunter saying there's this job in Hong Kong. Do you want to have a look at it? It's with Prudential. This was 2008. Yeah. And I walked home thinking, this is actually quite interesting. How do I broach this with my wife? And luckily, I have a wife who's completely up for adventure. I sat down talking about it, and she said, this sounds fantastic. Why are you dwelling on it? Let's go. So we picked up and left. And can I just say it was the most fabulous 11 years, that almost 12, that I've had career-wise. Yeah. Such a dynamic, fast-growing environment. Prudential was growing in leaps and bounds. I think we posted 38 quarters, almost 10 years. Not just growth, but record growth, quarter on quarter. And then the Eastspring opportunity, again, by complete chance. I was wandering the corridor one day and saw this gent I hadn't seen before, scribbling away on a board. My family wasn't with me at that stage, so I joined him. A 2-hour session turned into a whole weekend. We drew up the whole plan. And as I was walking away and congratulating him, he said, where are you going? I need an HRD. And so that was fantastic. We grew that business amazingly over 7 or 8 years across the whole of Asia. 15 or 16 locations. We opened in Europe, we opened in the US, UK, all great. And then it was time to call it quits, cash out and head home. So the dogs and the furniture went back to Australia. We told the kids we'd see them. And then I got a call saying, phenomenal opportunity to actually come and work in London, to work with an iconic name, which is obviously Aberdeen Standard Investments, with part of a turnaround. And I thought, I'm up for one more. Went through the whole interview process, and right at the end they said, actually, good news and bad news, we'd like to hire you, but we'd like the role to be based in Edinburgh. And like a complete idiot, I know London like the back of my hand, I kicked up such a fuss. And now I'm so glad they persuaded us to come to Edinburgh and have a look. My wife and I moved here, and we absolutely love it. So long and circuitous answer, but I guess it's been a long and circuitous career. It's mostly been by chance. And if there's one thing to take out of it is when an opportunity presents itself, for me, it's always been give it a go. You never know until you try it, whether you like it or not. And that's served me well.
Yeah. And so your kind of first adventure in Scotland was literally to move here for a job. You'd never been here before.
I had never been before, and the gods must have been conspiring in favour of Edinburgh. We arrived here in June or July to an absolutely beautiful day.
Yeah.
We were walking through all the glorious streets and crescents and so on and so forth. And I thought, this looks fantastic. Let me sign on the dotted line. I wonder what my approach would have been if I'd lobbed up in the middle of February.
Yeah, yeah, or even another day in June or July. To be honest, it must have been the lucky one.
It was a very lucky one, but a very lucky decision. My wife and I both really loved it. Now our kids now are grown, so they haven't joined us, and that gives us so much more flexibility. We really loved it.
Yeah. So what have been your early impressions of the business community here in Scotland? I suppose in comparison to Hong Kong and Australia, and has there been any either expected or surprising cultural differences?
I might rather do a three-way combination. I might stick to the difference between Hong Kong and Edinburgh. And the answer is yes. I think if you opened an atlas and you had to stick a pin into 5 different locations that are the polar opposite of Hong Kong, Edinburgh might surely be one of them. So very, very different. Just the dynamics of the way in which the two places are set up. So, for example, if you look at the whole of Scotland, it's about 5.5, 6 odd million.
Yeah.
People. I think Hong Kong has about 7 and a bit. But Hong Kong's is all in 1,000 square kilometers. And you really feel it. You feel that sort of, you feel people everywhere, and there's a plus and minus. Of course, they're very, very different. I mean, Hong Kong is a global and financial capital. It's a trade center. It's a global financial center. For how long, we're not quite sure. Geopolitics are taking an interesting turn.
Yeah.
Extremely different. It's a fast-paced, quite exhilarating environment. It's always on. You're aware that there are decisions being taken in Hong Kong that have ripples everywhere. So very, very different way of working. Quite a frenetic pace, a real global feel. So I've been in meetings in Hong Kong where there are no 2 people of the one nationality, meetings of 10 odd people. You see problems that you don't usually see in much more settled environments. Such rapid change taking place in the region, especially if you have a region. You look at older, established, almost decaying economies like a Japan. You look at places like Vietnam, where you can land at that airport 5 months apart and there'll be a new building there, right? Yeah. So very, very different in that particular way. The downside of working in Hong Kong, if you like, is that it's the exact flip side of the coin. It is always on. It genuinely is a work hard, play hard environment. You are working 12, 14-hour days were almost the norm.
Yeah.
There's a pace there that sometimes speed is of the essence. So you need to make decisions extremely quickly and extremely fast. There's not necessarily that much time for the slower thinking in terms of the way you go forward. So what I found with the business community here in Edinburgh is almost the polar opposite. So, and I'm speaking as a complete outsider here, so forgive me making a whole bunch of statements, and I don't mean to cause any offense by them. It's just my observations.
Yeah.
Let's start with the overwhelming positive. What I find in interfacing with the business community here is that there's a sophisticated, comprehensive decision-making process here. People take a lot of factors into account. I'm dusting off really old skills in writing board papers here. There's a way of very careful planning. There's a way of navigating around a very comprehensive legal and regulatory regime. I like that way in which it's considered and thoughtful. I like the way in which the ecosystems come together. I mean, everyone here knows everyone.
Yeah.
And people actually seek advice much more broadly than just from within their industry, from within their region. And it's incredibly supportive. You have people basically put out an SOS saying, I need help here, and everyone congregates. Hong Kong is much more competitive. It's much more about, why are they seeking that information from me? I'm not going to give that to you. At times quite cutthroat. Very, very supportive environment here. Going the other way, and it's something that I'll have to get used to because I don't think Edinburgh is going to change to suit me. There are times when I found the bias to action, I missed that a little bit in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So it's a case of not even 80%. It's a case of even if you get it 70%, 65% right, let's just try it.
Yeah.
There's more of a view here of let's get this right and then go forward. And I also have to say it's an incredibly supportive and welcoming environment. No doubt about it, it's also quite non-diverse. Right, and it's something that's improving and something that is getting better. But through a week here, I'd meet more people with surnames beginning with Mac than come from any other countries.
Yeah.
So, and that does add a different perspective, I think. It is how it is, and it is changing rapidly. And I'm meeting many Scots here who lived and travelled and worked overseas who bring that perspective. So that's my difference. But overwhelmingly, can I just say, incredibly supportive, very, very welcoming, and I've been made to feel a part of it very, very quickly. It's been great.
How do you think that situation might change around that? I suppose speed of action, and also the diversity point that you raise. Is that by encouraging more Scots to seek that international experience and bring some of that back? Is it about encouraging new people into the market, like you've came up to the kind of Scottish market? How do we improve that?
So it's an interesting question, actually. So firstly, can I just say that circumstantially it is going to change.
Yeah.
So everyone's focus has been on the impact of COVID. The other horrible B word is about to hit soon, which is Brexit.
Yep.
And I won't comment on the politics, but there is now increasing talk about whether Scotland should stand on its own. I don't think it really matters whether Scotland stands on its own or not. There needs to be a definition here of what is Scotland's place in the world. We are seeing trends going forward that all countries need to react to, but especially smaller countries, and smaller countries can be more nimble. So the path that it's going down, and by the way, this applies to Australia too, it's getting to a point where oil and gas revenues are actually starting to fall away now. Whether it's a longer term trend or not, who knows? There's a need for constant reinvention. What I'm seeing, which is really great, is the Scottish business community always talking about this now. What is it that we need to be famous for? What is it that we can be? If we can't just pipe it up and sell it, and it's not just going to be food exports and tourism, which is fantastic. Well, what are we going to be famous for? So that will drive it. So that's one thing that will happen. The second is that Scotland has a tremendous natural advantage. It's a great secret I'm trying not to share with the rest of the world, which is it's a fantastic place to live. It is incredibly livable. A few degrees warmer for an Aussie like me would be nicer, but leaving that to one side, maybe it's a good thing it's not. Everyone would be here. It has a phenomenal opportunity to brand itself as a great place for executives to come and live and work and create the right kind of opportunities, but it needs to brand itself as to what it wants to be and what does it want to attract. And in that particular sense, I think there needs to be a fair amount of work done in more certainty for the business community in terms of what the government's plans are.
Yeah.
What are the incentives for companies to set up and work here? Because it's become very globally competitive. Let me digress a little bit and give you a contrast. I spent quite a bit of time in Singapore. And while that very strong controlling mechanism may or may not be what sits well culturally, you have to hand it to them in terms of having an incredibly comprehensive plan for where that country sits. It's one of the few countries I've seen that actually has an HR plan. If you look on the Singapore government website, there's a full people and talent plan.
Yeah.
And they've thought through very clearly what they stand for, and the proposition goes out. If you want to be a business and you want to set up here, this is what you will get. Good and bad. I think that's the kind of branding that needs to happen. In terms of more diversity, one of the good things that I think has come out of COVID is this viewpoint that you can be connected up now with people all over the world at any particular point in time, delivering their expertise from anywhere. And can I just say, the quality of education, the quality of sophisticated thinking that exists here, I can largely talk about Edinburgh and Glasgow only. I haven't been traveling extensively elsewhere, and I don't know the business community anywhere else. In those two cities is world class. So it may well be that there's not the need now to pick up and go and work anywhere else to basically be able to deploy Scottish talent in a global context. My own personal prejudice, there's nothing like going and living somewhere else to really come up to speed. Yeah. And really understand what you're doing, and to be put in circumstances and situations that really test you and really extend you. So if I was talking to a young Scot now, I'd say go take the opportunity, go travel and do what you need to do. More experienced, older executives who don't feel the need to uproot themselves, I think opportunities will come up that could even give the best of both worlds. You can live, work, enjoy the lifestyle here and take part in global organizations. And finally, that becomes a double-edged sword, I think, for Scottish companies that don't have a great global presence. Because talent now will seek out fantastic opportunities. And if you can remain here and work globally, that is quite a significant threat. Let me just address the final point, which is around greater diversity. Very hard to change the social structure and setup, right? If there isn't that diversity existing in general, very hard to get it into your companies. I'm a big one and an unabashed fan of cutting down as many boundaries in the world as possible. Because, of course, I'm a beneficiary, so maybe I'm a little bit biased. I mean, it's phenomenal that someone born in India, raised in Australia, built a big career in Asia, can be considered and come here to work. Yeah. Great experience for me. I hope I bring something to the organization, but more importantly, the organization is giving me so much. It's a lovely mutual thing, and I think I'd love to see a world where this becomes more common. In many, many ways, it's becoming less common. So it's going to be a very difficult thing to manage that boundary. So in short, I'd say the diversity piece will take care of itself if there's a viewpoint that's put forward as to what Scotland's going to be famous for. You will attract the talent.
You raised an interesting point there about barriers or barriers no longer being there around where you live or work, and companies being much more open around looking at talent regardless of where they're based. And there's been lots of talk about that during the pandemic, but I guess from a recruitment point of view, we've not yet really seen that come through. And it was interesting to get your point, because to me it's one of those things that many will talk about, but it will be interesting as to whether or not the reality actually lives to that, because as people, we're creatures of habit, and we like to be working alongside people in a similar location to the ones we're based in. I'd be interested in getting your take as to whether or not you really firmly believe this is a kind of new world of work.
That is absolutely true, Mark. And you know what? You could well be right. People have a way of snapping back to inverted commas normality very quickly. So It could well be that the vaccine rolls out, we're all fine, and we get into August next year and we're working exactly the same way. But a couple of points. The first one is that and it's a big if you're a global company already by nature, it's interesting what this pandemic has done. So when I'm talking to members of my team and other teams within Standard Life who are beaming in from elsewhere, the conversations have been much more rich and productive because we have actually been online. So rather than Singapore or Hong Kong or Bangkok or Philadelphia, offices being represented by a square on the screen in the corner and everybody else in the same room, we have to get them to participate. There's been this lovely democratization and equalization. So there's a view now that whatever happens going forward, wherever teams are based, I'm actually going to be running these meetings, as many as I can, in this manner, just to get that input. So that's one. Yeah. The second is where you've looked at it, and the point of view that you've come up with is it's almost like you have an entire, or 99% of a company based in one location and one lone source somewhere else dialing in. I think what this pandemic is showing is maybe you can actually disperse if you're a global organization, where you're basing entire sections. So if you are, for example, the head of technology for a particular firm and you want to build out your team in a tech center, Silicon Valley or somewhere in a province in China, because that's where the best is, you can assemble your entire team there. It's not a case of one-offs, darling.
Yeah.
Where I think you are right, where I think you are 100% right, is that as companies rebuild, as we go through trying to reconnect with our customer base and trying to basically establish ourselves in the post-pandemic world, there is something nice about having your team around you, about having your team being able to brainstorm ideas, about that sort of interaction as it works. And that I can see is actually a very, very powerful force. I'm really enjoying, even with a few people in the office, being back here, because it's amazing how you can kick around these ideas. So yes, I think you're right. It will be an interesting thing to see whether this can happen or not. And perhaps it's more related to certain kinds of roles, where you can have a bit more, a bit less hands-on control, and people can actually work from elsewhere versus in here. So you're right. I think the jury is out, and let's see what happens. I think it would be a shame if we lost the lessons from the pandemic and excluded possibilities.
You of course joined a business that was already going through significant organisational change, and then obviously the pandemic hit just to make things a bit more complicated. How have you managed that from I guess from a people point of view, and what have been some of the learnings that you think have emerged from it?
Incredibly interesting time, simply because the merger of the various entities to form Standard Life Aberdeen took place almost about three years ago. And I think it's perfectly fair to say that that merger, while it's yielded significant benefits, hasn't yielded the kind of benefits that the organization would want. So there was already that aspect of having to change faster to come up to speed, and then of course the pandemic hit. Just as a general point, I'm not sure that the pandemic necessarily has brought something incredibly new, as much as it has exposed what already exists. And let me switch to the positive side. One of the most remarkable things for me to see here was the way in which our organization instantly snapped into a mode where welfare of our customers, clients, and staff became the number one driver. That for me was actually fantastic. And I think the pandemic simply highlighted that. I think we've always been that sort of company. Yeah. So very, very quickly, staff were moved home. Their safety was paramount. If you look at one particularly good illustration, our US office moved people home way before the trend took off there. And thank heavens, the people in our offices there were safely quarantined at home when governments in the US weren't responding fast enough. And arguably it was the same here in the UK. We were all home, set up and working very, very effectively and efficiently from day one. The second thing a pandemic does do is, while it doesn't fundamentally affect your culture, it can reprioritize. And the art of the possible suddenly becomes paramount. Yeah. So the best illustration, and by the way, and heroes emerge from the most amazing quarters. You see leadership emerging from across the organization, not just from the top, as it should. So I am completely in awe of our technology team, for example, the way in which they moved very quickly with what I originally perceived to be quite unwieldy technology, and I think was. The technology integration hadn't proceeded as fast as I would have thought it had post-merger. Instantly, they had us all working from home. Instantly, they had the right kind of support. They ensured that the interests of our clients were paramount. We kept going as a business, but also that people were looked after. So I think that was, those two, for me, illustrate that the culture of a company actually comes out during the pandemic. It's harshly illustrative in some ways when you see cultures that start to fail. But I'd argue that's the problem with the culture in the first place, not the pandemic. One thing we then did also do was, I think people are getting a little bit tired of this, we constantly polled them. We constantly sent out surveys. How are you feeling? What is the mood of the organization? What can we do? And that, I think, really helped us. And the feedback was incredibly positive. One thing it has brought home to me, though, is to never assume anything about a commonality of experience, because people have been having vastly different experiences through this pandemic. So, for example, our early careers team, a fantastic early careers team, they were going above and beyond to set people up with things that more senior executives would take for granted. Yeah. Place to work, kit at home where you could dial in, all that sort of stuff. And then the circumstances are so hugely different. My wife and I mean, our children are grown, they're back in Australia. We managed fine. If it was in a bubble, we'd assume, well, everyone has a desk to work at.
Yeah, yeah.
And yet I was dealing with team members who have young children at home, team members worried sick because they're caring for elderly relatives and can't get to see them. What it does then also bring out is the need for true leadership and being able to accommodate these differences and bring out that humanity more so than in other circumstances. And in that sense, it's actually been quite good. If I can flip briefly to the other side, what it has also brought home, I think, incredibly starkly to, I think, most companies, but not just us, it is in fact the real danger of when you're in the office, how siloed you can become. Yeah. So it's been great for us having these cross-functional meetings, reaching out there. It's illustrated to us the dangers that we've had in the past of maybe not working that way. Yeah. As effectively as we had in the past. That's hopefully one thing we can take forward. And finally, I know this is a cliche point, and I'm sure all your other interview subjects are telling you this. There's a real redefinition around the role of the office. What is the role of the office? And this is one change I'd like to see people start to really talk about, because it seems so nonsensical to have people turn up to a physical location, go and sit at their desks, and just literally tap away at computers like battery hens, producing a whole bunch of outputs that could just as easily be produced at home or in a cafe. Yeah. So what is it that we're going to do to change both the role of the office and offer people flexibility? And I think this is going to be something that really steps out the companies of tomorrow in terms of competitiveness. Yeah. How can we accommodate different ways of working that are good for the individual, but can also then accommodate teams and build them? I don't profess to know the answers, but at the very least, both ourselves and a lot of other companies are asking the questions, which is a good thing.
I mean, you've talked about some of those key themes. So the things we've been discussing with clients and hearing from clients are areas like that home versus office, balance in a family and work. Maintenance of productivity has been a good one. Many companies have survived, but arguably how many of them have thrived? And as we move forward, how do you turn that kind of survival to much more of a thriving environment? And of course, you mentioned it, that loneliness and mental health of employees has also become huge. I mean, looking beyond this and looking forward to that kind of post-pandemic world that we're really all desperate for. I mean, what do you think the kind of workplace of the future should look like, bearing in mind some of those key themes?
You see, you're touching on something that's absolutely huge, Mark, because of course, there are some entities that will just survive and thrive, and there are many, many entities that won't. Just last week, we saw the hopefully temporary collapse of Debenhams. I believe there's a buyer in the wings, but who knows? Yeah. Many, many other companies going under. And if I can digress a little bit, what this pandemic is also exposing, not raising, exposing, is the structural inequity that's built into a lot of our inequality that's built into a lot of our workforces. So, for example, I was reading a quite stunning, sobering report saying that the job losses post-pandemic could actually set back gender equality quite dramatically, because so many of the professions being affected, whether it's hospitality or healthcare or retail, are so heavily dominated by women. So there's a huge structural issue that's going to come out of this. And also it's fundamentally changing a lot of our habits. Right. So I've become far more comfortable online shopping than I was previously because, quite frankly, I've had no choice. And there were certain things I swore I'd never buy online that I now do. How does that change? How does that change the high street? How does that change smaller towns where you have a major store that is the anchor and that store will no longer exist? There's a heap that needs to be done here. So this is starting to get into something that I really like about living and working here in Edinburgh. And I'm sure Scotland in general, which is a view from companies that it is no longer just about shareholders and even about employees. It's about a broader sense. So from an investment side, we have huge commitment to rolling out products and our own ethos around what's called ESG, right?
Yeah.
Environment, social governance.
Yeah.
I think more and more this will be a big pressure point for companies. And it's one heck of a challenge. So on the one hand, it's a very natural thing, and you'd argue almost an essential thing for survival, where companies need to downsize. They need to strip out costs, and for many companies that means stripping out headcount.
Yeah.
They need to remain efficient, and they need to basically work for shareholders, which companies are set up for originally. But I think no longer can you do that in isolation. I think companies now actually have a commitment to the environments in which they work, and that balance now needs to be more and more in terms of job creation, in terms of providing the economic engine to drive the recovery going forward. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think the role of the company now is something that's going to be much more broadly, and I think we'll be judged, by the way, we'll be judged by broader society in terms of what we do there. Now, can I just hasten to add that does not mean absolutely that you can ever go to a system where you're not safeguarding your shareholders' welfare and your shareholders' investments. Difficult decisions need to be made. They absolutely need to be made. And I'm in no way, shape or form condemning companies that have to take decisions that in order to survive, their headcount needs to be reduced. We've seen it all the time. It doesn't happen. But having this broader social context and offering opportunities, and for example, taking active roles in building social equity. These are all things, diversity, all of it, these are all things now that are no longer nice to have some companies. I think all companies need to focus on.
Well, what a great place to bring our conversation to an end this morning. I really do appreciate your time, Gautam. It's been fascinating. We could elaborate on some of these points for hours, but I'm mindful of your time as well, and I'm grateful for it. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, Mark, and I'm very much looking forward to a time when we can sit around a bar and enjoy a conversation over a drink. I'm really missing the human aspect of company, but been my pleasure. I hope it's been interesting.
It's been great. Many thanks.
My pleasure.